You have seen this one before. The mouse Utopia. A scientist builds a paradise for mice. The mice go insane, the mice die, and every version hands you the same lesson, that they got too crowded. If that is the story you came for, you already have it, and you are free to go watch any of the 100 other videos that tell it that way. But here is the detail almost none of them mention. The box was never full. When that colony collapsed, it was sitting at less than a quarter of what its world could feed and house. There was food for 9,500, and they died at 2,200, with the hoppers still full and most of the apartments still empty. They did not run out of anything. They were handed everything. And the everything is what killed them. Tonight we follow that all the way down. The date the man who built it fixed for the death of the last mouse, calculated before that mouse was born. The ones he called the beautiful ones. The paper he titled Death Squared. And a country today, real, current, with a birth rate of 0.75, and a handful of survivors who were rescued, handed paradise a second time, and still could not come back. So settle in, subscribe or join if you have not, and if you want the wider map, the deep dives into physics and collapse and deep time that never fit inside one video that lives over on the Patreon. Stay to the end, because the thing that should frighten you here is not the mice. It is the question Calhoun left open about us, and whether the door he watched close has already, quietly, closed on you. Let's go back to where this began. In the summer of 1968, a scientist in Maryland built a perfect world and then sat in a chair above it and watched every single inhabitant die. Not from hunger. There was infinite food, refilled before it ever ran low, available at every hour from 16 separate stations that never once went empty. Not from thirst, not from cold. The temperature was held at a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round, season after season. Not from predators. There were none. He had engineered them out of existence. Not from disease. The founders were screened, and the enclosure was cleaned on a schedule. The animals living inside this world had everything a living thing has ever been built to want. Everything that 400 million years of evolution has ever pushed a body to chase, to fight for, to claw its way toward across deserts and winters and famines. They had all of it, handed to them, for free forever, and every last one of them was dead within 4 years. They did not starve. Nothing hunted them, nothing infected them. Nobody took anything from them. They were given a paradise with the locks removed and the dangers deleted, and the paradise is what killed them. The colony went extinct standing in the middle of an all-you-can-eat buffet that never ran out, surrounded by empty apartments they never bothered to fill, in a climate-controlled heaven with no rent and no winter and no death waiting in the dark. And that is the part that, more than 50 years later, nobody has been able to explain away. The man who built this world was named John Bumpus Calhoun. He was not a crank. He spent 33 years on the federal payroll at the National Institute of Mental Health, which is about as close to the center of mainstream American science as a behavioral biologist could get in the 20th century. He had a doctorate in zoology from Northwestern. He published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of Medicine. And what he found inside that enclosure was so disturbing that he spent the rest of his life trying to convince the world it was talking about us, and the world spent the rest of his life refusing to listen, and then, after he died, turned his life's work into a creepypasta. A scary story you half remember from somewhere on the internet. Mouse heaven that turned into mouse hell. Too many mice in a box. That version, the version you have probably absorbed by osmosis, the overcrowding version, is wrong. It is not slightly wrong. It is wrong about the single most important fact in the entire experiment. And the reason that matters, the reason I have not been able to stop thinking about it since I started reading the actual paper instead of the legend, is that the real mechanism, the thing that actually killed them, is not a thing that happens to animals crammed into too small a space. It is a thing that happens to populations given too much. The mouse colony did not die because there were too many of them for the world they lived in. They died of abundance. They died of having every need met. And there is a number, buried in Calhoun's own paper, that proves it, that he wrote down himself, that almost nobody who repeats this story has ever actually read. I am going to give you that number. But before I do, I need you to sit with one detail, because it is the detail that turns this from a sad story about rodents into something that should change the way you feel about the floor you are standing on right now. There was a moment, a specific dateable moment, when the population inside that world was larger than it had ever been. More mice than Calhoun had ever managed to grow in any of his previous attempts. And he had made many attempts. The thing was booming, packed, loud, alive, and on that day, at the absolute peak, Calhoun looked at his thriving, overflowing colony and concluded that it was already dead. That the time of death had, in the only sense that mattered, already passed. That what he was looking at was a corpse that had not yet noticed. He was right. He even calculated the exact date the last one would die, and he calculated it, in effect, before that mouse was born. How a man arrives at the certainty that a healthy, growing, abundant population is already extinct, and how he turned out to be correct down to the level of a calendar date, is the whole story. And the part of it I most want you to hold, the part that the legend cannot hold because the legend is about crowding, is this. The thing that killed them was not the dying. The dying was the easy part, the visible part, the part that came last. Something happened before the dying while everything still looked like success, and that earlier thing was the real death, and it was the thing that made all the rest unstoppable. It has a name. Calhoun gave it one, and by the time we get to that name, I suspect you are going to recognize it, not from a textbook, but from somewhere much closer to home. It starts, the way these things tend to start, with a young man standing at the edge of a field, watching animals, and noticing something that did not fit. He was, by his own description, a Tennessee country boy, born on the 11th of May, 1917, in Elkton, a small town in the south of the state, the son of a high school principal and an art teacher. And from the time he was a boy he was obsessed, in the specific, intense, slightly solitary way that produces scientists, with birds. He banded them. He joined the Tennessee Ornithological Society as a teenager and trekked around the countryside with an older mentor, a woman named Amelia Lasky, attaching little numbered rings to the legs of birds so that their movements could be tracked across time and space. He published his first scientific article in an ornithology journal called The Migrant when he was 15 years old. 15, and buried in that childhood hobby, is the entire shape of the work that would consume his life. Because what a bird bander does, fundamentally, is turn a faceless population into a set of known individuals and then follow them, one by one, to see where they go and what becomes of them. He would do exactly that, for the rest of his career, to rats and then to mice. In worlds he built himself. He was always, from the age of 15, in the business of marking every individual in a population and watching to see who lived and who did not. He took a bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia and then a doctorate in zoology from Northwestern, finished in 1943, and his thesis was on the 24-hour activity rhythms of the Norway rat, the daily clock that governs when an animal wakes and feeds and moves. He met his wife, Edith, at Northwestern, and then, after some teaching and a stretch at a research lab, he landed in 1946 on a project that would set the rest of his life in motion, the Johns Hopkins Rodent Ecology Project in Baltimore, You have to understand why a serious university had an entire project devoted to the ecology of rats in the 1940s. Because the context is not academic, it is grim and practical. Cities were overrun. Rats were a wartime problem, a public health emergency, a destroyer of food stores, and the whole point of the Hopkins project was, bluntly, to figure out how to kill them more effectively. Calhoun was hired into a rat extermination program, and what he discovered almost immediately was that nobody actually understood how rat populations regulated themselves, how big they got and why they stopped getting bigger, and that this gap in knowledge was the thing standing between the exterminators and their goal. So he proposed to find out, not by poisoning them, but by giving a population everything it needed and simply watching, with the patience of a man who had spent his boyhood waiting in fields for birds to see what it would do. It was 1947, and he fenced off about 10,000 square feet of ground behind a house in Towson, just outside Baltimore, and dropped in a small founding group of wild Norway rats. And then he fed them, and protected them, and counted them for 28 months to see what a rat population does when you remove the things that normally keep it small. What he expected, what anyone would have expected, what the whole logic of an extermination program assumed, was an explosion. Do the arithmetic on rat fertility, and that pen should have been a black heaving carpet of them. 5 breeding females left alone with food and shelter for 2 years could in principle have produced something on the order of 50,000 descendants. The space could easily have held many thousands. It held about 150. The number never climbed past roughly 200, and it kept settling back to around 150. And it did this not because anything was killing them, but because the rats themselves stopped. They organised into a dozen or so colonies of roughly a dozen animals each, and at that size, the social machinery worked. Beyond it, something went wrong. Calhoun would spend the next 4 decades circling that number, 12. The way a man circles a thing he suspects is a law of nature he was not supposed to find. He came to believe there was a maximum number of other individuals any single animal could maintain genuine social relationships with, a hard ceiling on the size of a functioning social world, and that when a population was forced past that ceiling. When there were simply more bodies present than the mind was built, to track and know and rank, the relationships did not scale up to accommodate them. They broke down. The animals were not running out of food. They were running out of room in each other's heads. And there was a second half to what he saw in that Towson pen, one that matters as much as the ceiling of 12, because it is the part that the sealed universes would later remove. The Towson rats had an escape. The pen was large, and a rat who lost the competition for a place in one of the colonies could withdraw to the margins, could hold a low profile at the edges, could in principle have left if there had been anywhere to go. The population stabilised at 150 in part because the social system had somewhere to put its failures, room to spread out, a periphery. Calhoun watched the colonies form at the optimal size and watched the surplus settle uneasily around them, and he took from it a lesson he would spend the rest of his life trying to engineer around. A healthy population is not one with no losers. Every population has losers. A healthy population is one that has somewhere to put them, a frontier, an edge, a margin, an exit, a way for the ones who do not fit the existing structure to disperse and try again elsewhere rather than piling up inside it. Take away the somewhere to go, and the losers do not vanish. They accumulate at the centre of the very society that has no place for them, and their accumulation is the poison. He learned that from wild rats in a Maryland backyard in 1948, and 20 years later he would build a world with the exit deliberately sealed to see precisely what the accumulation would do when it had nowhere at all to drain. You already know what it did. That is a strange and specific and frankly haunting idea, and I want you to hold on to it, because it is the thing the popular version of this story throws away, and it is the thing that makes the whole nightmare apply eventually to you. If you have ever heard the phrase Dunbar's number, the rough cap on how many real relationships a human being can hold, you have heard a much later, much more famous version of the thing Calhoun was already staring at, in a pen full of rats in 1948. He just never got the credit, which is going to become a theme. The Towson rats taught him that a population polices its own size through behaviour, through the breakdown of social structure, long before it runs out of physical resources. But the field was messy. The rats were wild, hard to observe, impossible to track as individuals through the burrows. He wanted control. He wanted to build the world himself, so that nothing happened in it that he had not designed, and so that he could watch every animal, by name, from birth to death. So in the late 1950s, he moved the work into a barn on a farm outside Rockville, Maryland, owned by a man named Casey, and he stopped using open ground. Now he built rooms, enclosed universes he started calling them, 4 connected pens linked by ramps, 10 feet by 14, sealed, controlled, observable, where he could provide everything and remove everything and watch what a population did inside a world with no exits. And it was here, in these built worlds, in the late 50s and very early 60s, that he saw the thing that would make him briefly famous and permanently misunderstood. He gave it a name that he chose with deliberate care, because he wanted the ugliness of it to be unmistakable, because he did not want anyone to be able to make it sound neutral. He called it the behavioural sink. Here is what a behavioural sink is, and it is worse and stranger than the name suggests, and it is nothing like overcrowding. Calhoun had set up his pens so that food was available in more than one place. There was no physical reason for the animals to pile up in any single spot. But he noticed that the rats had learned to associate the act of eating with the presence of other rats. They had been raised in proximity, fed in company, and so feeding had become, in their minds, a social event, something you did alongside others. And so they began to choose to eat together. They would walk past an empty feeder to crowd into an occupied one. They would wait, pressed body to body, for a turn at a single dish, while 2 more sat unused a short distance away. The crowding was not imposed on them by scarcity. They manufactured it. They sought it out. They were drawn, against their own interest, toward the single densest point in the room, and the more of them gathered there, the more the gathering felt normal, and the more normal it felt, the more it pulled in, and the whole thing fed on itself and dragged the population down into a kind of drain. A sink. Calhoun wrote, plainly, that the unhealthy connotations of the word were not accidental, and the architecture of those barn universes made it worse, in a way that turned out to be the whole secret. Calhoun had built them as 4 pens connected in a row by ramps, and the 2 end pens had only 1 connection each, while the middle pens had 2. That meant the end pens could be held. A single strong male could plant himself at the foot of the one ramp into an end pen and defend it, and inside that defended pen a small, almost normal society could form, a male with a harem of females raising young in relative peace, the way mice are supposed to live. But the middle pens, with their 2 openings, could not be defended by anyone, and so every animal that could not win an end pen washed into the middle, and the middle filled. And the eating together habit concentrated everyone at the feeders there, and the density in the 2 middle pens climbed to grotesque levels, while the end pens stayed calm. The pathology was not spread evenly across the available space. It pooled, in the places no one could control, exactly as water pools at the low point of a floor. That is why he called it a sink. He had not designed it to happen. He had designed a neutral apartment block, and the animals had sorted themselves, by who could hold a defensible space and who could not, into a small zone of order at the edges, and a churning, undefendable, overcrowded drain in the middle, and almost all of the breakdown happened in the drain. Remember the defensible end pens. The fact that some animals, the ones who could control their own space, stayed more or less fine, is going to come back at the very end of this story and change the meaning of everything. I need you to notice exactly what happened there, because it is the hinge the entire story turns on, and it is the thing that gets erased. The pathology was not a response to a lack of space. It was a learned attraction to density. The animals were not trapped in the sink against their will. They walked into it. They preferred it. And once enough of them were in it, the young-born there knew nothing else, had never experienced a world that was not the sink, and so they could not climb out, because you cannot climb out of a place you do not know you are inside. And inside that sink, the social order came apart in ways that Calhoun catalogued with the unsentimental eye of a man who had been marking individuals since he was 15. The dominant males, a few of them, held territory and did relatively well, and you should remember that detail, because it becomes enormously important later. But most did not, and among the rest, distinct, recurring, terrible character types appeared, the same types in pen after pen, as if the breakdown were following a script. There were the probers, hyperactive males who had abandoned all the normal rituals of courtship, who would chase females relentlessly, who would follow them down into their burrows, which a normal male would never do, and who sometimes cannibalized the young they found there. There were what he called pansexual males, who had lost the ability to distinguish appropriate partners and attempted to mount everything, male, female, juvenile, indiscriminately. There were the withdrawn ones, the somnambulists, the sleepwalkers, who moved through the colony in a kind of social coma, neither attacking nor mating nor fleeing, ignoring every other animal and ignored by all of them in return, present in body and absent in every other sense. And the females in the worst of the sink, with their nests constantly invaded and their normal protections gone, began to fail at the one task the whole apparatus of evolution is built around. Infant mortality in some of those rat pens reached as high as 96%. 96 out of every 100 pups born, dead before weaning, many of them eaten, in a pen with plenty of food. That finding, the behavioural sink and its monstrous cast of characters, ran in Scientific American on the 1st of February 1962 in a paper titled Population Density and Social Pathology, and it detonated into the culture with a force that is hard to overstate now. This was the peak of the overpopulation panic, the bomb shelter, the planet is filling up, end of the world anxiety that would crest a few years later, with Paul Ehrlich's 1968 bestseller, The Population Bomb. Calhoun's crowded, deranged, cannibalizing rats were precisely the horror the era was primed to see, a laboratory preview of what everyone feared the future cities of mankind would become. And the paper became one of the most cited articles in the history of its field, referenced something on the order of 150 times a year at its height. The novelist and journalist Tom Wolfe took the phrase straight out of the laboratory and onto the street in 1966, in an essay about New York titled "O Rotten Gotham, Sliding Down into the Behavioral Sink," in which he stood in the crush of Grand Central at rush hour and saw, in the faces of the commuters, Calhoun's rats. The idea seeped into the design of cities, into the new field of personal space and proxemics that the anthropologist Edward Hall was building, into films like Soylent Green and A Clockwork Orange and Logan's Run, into the bloodstream of how an entire generation thought about crowds and cities and the shape of the years to come. And here is the first place the scientific and popular establishment did the thing it does. The thing that is going to recur through this entire story like a pulse, so watch for it now and you will see it again and again. Everyone took the diagnosis. The crowded rats, the violence, the breakdown, the warning about overpopulated cities. That part was vivid and quotable, and it confirmed what people already feared, and so it spread everywhere. What got left on the table, unread, unrepeated, quietly discarded, was the mechanism, because the behavioural sink was never actually about how many. It was about a learned, self-reinforcing pull toward each other that overrode every individual instinct for self-preservation. A pathology of social saturation, not of square footage. But that is a subtle, uncomfortable, hard-to-film idea, far harder to fit on a magazine cover than a pen full of cannibal rats, and so it was dropped. And the crude version, too many bodies in too little space, is the version that survived and reproduced, and that you inherited. The wrong one. First it was a finding about how social structure collapses under involuntary saturation. Then it became a poster for overpopulation. The one thing it was not allowed to remain was the difficult, accurate thing it actually was. Calhoun knew the rats were not the final word. They were wild, hard to track individually, hard to keep clean, hard to know. He wanted something better, a controlled population he could follow from the first founder to the last survivor, every animal known, every relationship mapped, every birth and death recorded. So he switched species to mice, easier to manage, easier to breed, easier to watch, and he started building utopias. That is genuinely, precisely the word he used. Utopia, he would construct an enclosed world, populate it with a small number of founders, provide everything they could need, remove every threat, and let it run, and watch. Universe 1, Universe 2. He built them and ran them, and they kept getting cut short, often with an irony he must have felt in his teeth, by a shortage of laboratory space. The man studying what happens when a population runs out of room kept running out of room for his experiments about running out of room. Universe after universe, never quite finished, the populations never allowed to play all the way out to their natural end. And then he built the 25th one, and for the first time he let it run until there was nothing left alive to watch. He called it Universe 25, and I should pause here to kill a piece of the legend, because the internet version of this story will tell you that he ran the experiment and then repeated it 25 times and got the same result every time, and that is false. There were not 25 identical experiments. There was a long series of differing builds, each one teaching him something. And Universe 25 was simply the 25th iteration, and the first one he carried all the way through to the end. It was run once, to completion, and that single run is what we are talking about. The horror does not come from repetition, it comes from completeness. He let one of them finish. The thing he built for that final run was, by the standards of a mouse, the closest approximation to an actual heaven that has ever been deliberately constructed by a human being, and I want to walk you through it in physical detail. The way you would walk through a building you were thinking of living in, because every single specification was chosen to remove a reason to die, and because when you understand exactly how complete the provision was, the ending stops making the kind of sense you want it to make. It was a square pen. Each of the 4 walls ran 101 inches, which is a little over 2.5 meters, so the floor was a square sum 8.5 feet on a side. The walls rose 54 inches, a little over 4 feet. The lower portion was built so that the mice could climb it and move around its full structure, but the topmost 17 inches was bare, polished, galvanized sheet metal that no mouse could get a grip on, so there was no escape, and, just as importantly, no fear of escape, no edge to fall from, no outside to fear. A sealed, finished, total world. Set into the walls were vertical mesh tunnels, and the tunnels led up to nesting boxes. Little apartments stacked in the walls like the units of an apartment building. and there were 256 of them. 256 homes. Calhoun himself described the layout as something like 16 apartment buildings, 4 to a side, and each individual nest box could comfortably hold around 15 mice. Food hoppers and water bottles were distributed around the pen so that no animal ever had to travel far, or wait long, or compete or fight to eat or to drink. There was no scarcity of anything to fight over, because there was nothing to fight over, because everything was everywhere, always. And Calhoun, being a careful man, did the arithmetic on his own paradise and worked out exactly how much of everything it could support. And those numbers are the numbers that nobody quotes, the numbers that the overcrowding legend cannot survive contact with. So here they are, and I would ask you to actually hold them in your mind rather than letting them slide past as statistics. The food supply, he calculated, would not become a limiting factor until the population reached 9,500 mice. The water would not run short until 6,144. And the nesting space, the homes, the shelter, would not fill up until the population passed 3,840. Now hold all three of those, because everything that is about to happen happened underneath them. Underneath every one of them. The colony never came close to any of those ceilings. Not the food ceiling, not the water ceiling, not even the housing ceiling. At no point in the entire experiment did these animals run out of anything. Not calories, not water, not shelter, not space. The collapse you are about to watch happened inside a world that still had, by some measures, the better part of its resources sitting there unused at the very moment of peak population. So whatever killed them, and something killed all of them, every last one, it was not scarcity. We can take scarcity off the table right now, on Calhoun's own arithmetic, before the story even properly begins. Remember that. Hold it. The next time anyone tells you these mice died of overcrowding. The world was never full. The hoppers were never empty. The collapse came while there was still room for thousands more. On the 9th of July, 1968, he opened the door and put in the founders. 4 pairs. 8 mice. Healthy young albino house mice from the National Institutes of Health breeding stock, 48 days old, each one isolated for 3 weeks beforehand, so that, for them, this would be a genuine clean beginning in a new and empty world. 8 animals, in a sealed paradise built to shelter nearly 4,000, and feed nearly 10,000. The amount of room and plenty available to those first 8 mice is almost comic. They had a continent to themselves. And here is what Calhoun expected, because it matters that the ending surprised even him. He expected growth, of course, and then he expected the growth to level off as the population approached the limits he had built in, the food limit far away at 9,500. The housing limit at 3,840. He expected, in other words, a population that would rise and then stabilize near its resource ceiling, crowded perhaps, stressed perhaps, but persisting, a dense and enduring society pressed up against the edges of its abundance. That is the reasonable prediction. That is what the resource limit model of population, the model everyone used, says should happen. A population grows until it bumps against what feeds it, and then it holds there. What he did not expect, what no model predicted, what still has the power to unsettle anyone who follows it closely, was that the population would collapse and vanish entirely, while sitting at less than a quarter of the resource ceiling he had built. It never came close to running out of anything. It died with the cupboard overflowing. The gap between what the standard model predicted, stabilization near the limit, and what actually happened, total extinction nowhere near the limit, is the entire scientific content of this experiment, and it is the gap that told Calhoun he was looking at a limit nobody had measured before. a limit that had nothing to do with food or water or space, and everything to do with the structure of the social world, a ceiling not on the number the environment could feed, but on the number a society could hold and still remain a society. He had set out to find the resource limit of a mouse paradise. He found a different limit instead, one that bit thousands of mice earlier than the food ever would have, and that limit is the one that should concern us, because it is the only kind of limit a wealthy society ever actually hits. And then he started counting, and he started recording it in phases, because the population did not simply rise and fall in a smooth curve. It moved through stages, and the stages were so distinct, so reliably timed, so clean in their boundaries, that they read less like the messy history of a colony and more like the acts of a play that had been written before the curtain went up. He labelled them with letters. Phase A, Phase B, Phase C, Phase D. And in plain English he named them the strive period, the exploit period, the stagnation period, and the death period. And I will tell you now, so that it sits underneath everything that follows the way it sat underneath his own observations as he made them, that by the time Calhoun understood what Phase C and Phase D actually were, he had stopped believing he was describing 4 stages of a population. He had come to believe he was describing 2 entirely different kinds of death, and that the first kind, the one that comes first, is the one nobody ever sees coming, because the body keeps walking around, eating and grooming and breathing, long after it has happened. Phase A lasted about 104 days. The strive period, 8 strangers in a vast empty world, working out who they were to one another, establishing the first territories in all that available space, sorting the first hierarchy. There was friction, there was striving, hence the name, and then there were the first litters, and the moment the first pups were born and survived to weaning, Phase A ended, and the machine that Calhoun had built began to do the only thing he had designed it to do. It grew. And it grew the way a thing grows when, for the first time in the entire history of its species, absolutely nothing is stopping it. Phase B ran from around day 105 to around day 315, and across that stretch the population doubled roughly every 55 days. I want you to feel what that rate of doubling actually does, because the word doubling is doing a lot of quiet work. You start with a small number, and 55 days later you have twice as many. And 55 days after that twice again, and the curve does not climb, it goes nearly vertical. The population raced upward through almost 5 straight doublings, through 20, 40, 80, 160, 320, and the world filled with mice the way a stadium fills before a match, a steady relentless flood of new bodies, new life, new appetite. And to anyone glancing into that pen during Phase B, it would have looked like exactly the thing Calhoun set out to build, a flourishing society in a land of endless plenty. The exploit period. They were exploiting the abundance, converting the free, infinite gift of the world into more and more of themselves, faster and faster, and it looked, from the outside, like an unqualified, runaway success. I want to give you a way to feel the speed of that, because the numbers are easy to read past. Picture the world those 8 founders woke up in, a square floor more than 8 feet on a side, 256 furnished apartments, food and water at every turn, and 8 of them. Each mouse had in effect an entire wing of an apartment building to itself, a private estate, a degree of space and plenty that no wild mouse in the history of the species had ever known for even an hour. And then, 55 days later, 16, 55 days after that, 32. The estates shrank, quietly, with every doubling, not because anything was taken away, but because more and more heirs kept arriving to share the same fixed inheritance. By the time the population crossed 1,000, the same world that had been a private continent for 8 had become a crowded tenement for 1,000, and not one crumb of food, not one drop of water, not one square inch of floor had been removed. Nothing got worse. There was simply more and more company for a fixed amount of everything, and in a social animal, it turns out. That is the same thing as things getting worse, and it is a kind of getting worse that no inventory of supplies will ever show you. The hoppers stayed full the entire time. The crowding the founders' great-grandchildren felt was made entirely of each other. But somewhere in the middle of that explosion, before the growth had even visibly begun to slow, while the curve was still climbing, the thing that would ultimately kill them was already taking root. And it was taking root precisely because of how well things were going. The success was the cause. And to understand how a population's success becomes the seed of its own extinction, you have to understand what those mice were running out of, deep inside the abundance. Even as the food and the water and the housing remained effectively infinite. Because they were running out of something, just not anything you could ever put in a hopper or a bottle. They were running out of jobs. That word sounds strange applied to a mouse, so let me be exact about what I mean, because this is the engine of the entire collapse, and it is the part the simple version cannot accommodate, and it is the part where you should start to feel a faint, unwelcome flicker of recognition. In a normal mouse society, in the wild, in a world with edges and danger and scarcity, there is a structure, and the structure is built out of roles. There are territories to win and hold, which means there is a job called defending territory. And a male who is good at that job earns status and earns mates and matters. He has a place and a function and a reason to wake up and move. There is a job called rearing the young, which a female does inside a defended nest, protected by a male whose territory is worth defending. There is a constant, low, organising pressure, things to do, threats to meet, space to take and keep, problems that must be solved or you die. Status is scarce, mates are scarce, safe nesting sites are scarce, and because all of those things are scarce, they are worth striving for, and the striving sorts every animal into a society in which each one has a place, a rank, a function, a reason. Scarcity, the very thing Calhoun had abolished, is what builds the social structure in the first place. Now take all of the scarcity away. All of it. In Universe 25, the young males came of age into a world where every territory worth holding was already held, by the animals who had got there first, and there was nowhere new to go, because the walls were sealed and polished and 4 feet high, and there was no reason to disperse, because there was no frontier. No empty meadow over the next hill, no unclaimed valley, just more of the same packed, perfect, finished world in every direction. In the wild, this is the moment the system has a release valve. A young male who loses the fight for a territory leaves. He strikes out, finds new ground, starts his own line somewhere else. That dispersal, that exit, that somewhere else, is the pressure relief valve of essentially every mammalian society on Earth. And Calhoun, without meaning to, in the act of building a kindness, had welded that valve shut. He had removed danger, removed predators, removed the killing cold and the killing hunger, and the result, the thing he had not foreseen, was that the losers of the social competition, and in a fast-growing population the great majority of the young, are losers, because the winners arrived first and took everything, now had nowhere to go and nothing to do. They could not earn a territory, because there were none left. They could not earn status, because the ranks were full, and here is the cruelty hidden inside the kindness, the thing that makes paradise the murder weapon. They also could not die. In the wild, a surplus young male who loses everything is cleared out fast. He is killed defending a hopeless position, or he starves, or he freezes, or an owl takes him in the night, and the brutal economy of nature removes him and makes room for the next attempt. In Calhoun's heaven, nothing cleared them out. Nothing was allowed to. So they did not disperse, and they did not die, and they did not earn a place. They simply accumulated. A swelling, growing surplus of healthy young adult males with no role, no rank, no territory, no mate, no purpose, and no exit, piling up in the open central spaces of a world that had no use for them, would not let them leave, and would not let them die. That is the behavioural sink returned in a new and more terrible form than the rats ever showed. And it is the first time in this story I am going to reach for a word that I am going to keep reaching for, because Calhoun reached for it, and because nothing gentler is honest enough. These animals were not crowded, they were rejected. The space around them was not full of bodies pressing in, it was full of failure that had nowhere to drain, and the failures had no way out in any direction, including the one direction, death, that nature normally uses to clean up failure. They were trapped, not by walls, but by abundance itself, in a permanent surplus state, alive and unneeded. So they withdrew. The rejected males gathered toward the centre of the pen, in the open floor, and they formed great inert pools, hundreds of animals eventually, simply existing in proximity to one another without relating to one another in any meaningful way, and periodically a kind of motiveless violence would move through these pools like weather across a field. One animal would be jostled, would suddenly lash out, would attack another, and the one attacked would neither fight back nor flee, because fleeing requires somewhere to flee to and there was nowhere, so he would simply absorb it, take the damage, and then later, jostled himself, become an attacker in his turn. The aggression had no function whatsoever. It defended nothing, won nothing, claimed nothing, established no order. It was simply the discharge of energy that in a working world would have built and held a life, now sparking off uselessly in a crowd of beings who had nothing left to spend it on. Violence had become weather. It just happened to whoever was nearby for no reason, and then it stopped, and then it happened again. And inside that pooling surplus the old cast of characters reassembled, the same types Calhoun had catalogued years earlier in the rats, as if the breakdown of a social order always produces the same broken roles regardless of the species running it. There were the withdrawn ones again, the ones he had called somnambulists in the rats, moving through the universe in a waking sleep, eating and drinking at the margins of activity, registering no other animal as either threat or mate or companion, sealed inside themselves. There were hyperactive males who had abandoned every ritual of normal courtship, who pursued without the patterned approach a female recognizes and responds to, who would mount animals without regard to sex or readiness or response. The whole delicate choreography of mouse reproduction flattened into something frantic and meaningless, and among the females, a particularly bleak inversion. Some of them, forced to defend nests that no male was reliably holding for them, became as aggressive as territorial males, took the role on themselves out of sheer necessity. And Calhoun noted this masculinization of female behaviour with the same flat precision he brought to everything, the females driven by the failure of the males into a role that evolution had never assigned them, and which left no one anywhere in the entire structure free to do the thing that females alone can do. The roles had not just emptied out, they had scrambled. Males who would not court, females who could not nest, young driven off before they could learn to become either. A society does not simply shrink when it dies, it garbles. Every part keeps moving and none of the parts fit together anymore, and the motion looks, from any distance at all, almost exactly like life. And while the rejected males pooled and festered and randomly detonated in the open floor, something quieter and ultimately far worse was happening up in the apartments, among the females, and it struck directly at the one thing no population can survive losing. The females were still, for a while, trying to breed. The dominant males still held their territories early on, still tried to defend the nests within them. But the defence was failing, and it was failing because of the sheer, relentless number of aimless intruders, the rejected and the probing and the withdrawn, wandering through everything, with no territory of their own to keep them anywhere. No single male, however capable, could keep a territory secure against that constant tide of trespass. Nests that should have been sanctuaries kept being penetrated, and the females, who in a functioning world would have been protected while they raised their young, found themselves having to do the defending themselves, alone, constantly. They became aggressive, which is not their normal mode, and the aggression, which like everything else in this world, had nowhere appropriate to go. Eventually turned in the worst imaginable direction. It turned on their own offspring. Mothers began attacking their own pups, wounding them, driving them out of the nest days before they should have been weaned, before they were ready, abandoning them to the open floor. Females would carry litters and then drop them mid-transport and simply walk away and not retrieve them, scattering their young across the pen like dropped litter. The rate at which the young survived to weaning fell, and then fell further, and then in parts of the universe it approached zero. In a closely related universe Calhoun ran alongside this work, he documented the breeding fate of a cohort of females born into the late stages. And the numbers are bleak in a way that statistics rarely manage to be. Of nearly 150 females, examined at an age when they should long since have been mothers, only around 18 in 100 had ever conceived at all, and only 2 in 100 were pregnant. The rest had simply never reproduced in a paradise built to feed 10,000, with empty nurseries waiting all around them. And among those that did conceive, pregnancies were increasingly resorbed, lost and reabsorbed by the body before birth, the female physiology itself seeming to withdraw from the entire project of making the next generation, to give up before the pup was even born. I want to stop here and make sure the full weight of this lands properly, because it is the kind of thing the eye slides over. This is a population with infinite food and infinite water and hundreds of empty homes in which the mothers stopped successfully raising children. Not because they could not feed them, the food was endless. Not because there was no room, there were empty apartments by the score. The maternal behaviour itself, the oldest, deepest, most reliable, most heavily armoured programme in the entire mammalian repertoire, the one piece of behaviour you would bet your life would survive anything, because the survival of every mammal species has always depended on it, simply came apart. In paradise. Surrounded by every single thing a mother could possibly need to succeed. The thing that broke was not in the environment. The environment was materially flawless. The thing that broke was inside them. And once it broke, no amount of flawless environment could fix it. Around day 315, the growth slowed, hard, and Phase C began. The stagnation period, the doubling time, which had been a brisk 55 days through all of Phase B, stretched out to around 145 days, and then the births and the deaths fought to a near standstill. The population was still technically climbing, but limping, the new arrivals barely outpacing the dying, and the society that should have organised all of these thousands of animals into a coherent functioning whole was now visibly, measurably disintegrating. Calhoun wrote a single sentence about the end of Phase C that I have read more times than is probably good for me, because of the gap between how clinical it sounds and how enormous the thing it describes actually is. He wrote that for all practical purposes there had been a death of societal organisation by the end of Phase C. A death of societal organisation. Read that again and let it be as large as it is. The animals were alive. They were eating, drinking, sleeping, breathing. Many of them were, in purely physical terms, perfectly healthy, and the society they belonged to was already dead. The structure, the roles, the ranks, the relationships, the entire invisible architecture that turns a pile of individual animals into a population capable of perpetuating itself across time. All of that was gone, finished, while every single individual mouse was still, in the obvious sense, alive, and it is here, watching a living colony whose society had already died. That Calhoun developed the idea that I have come to think is the real reason this experiment haunts people, even people who only half know it, even people who think it is nothing more than a creepy internet story about mice in a box. He proposed that there are 2 deaths, not one. There is the death you already know, the body stopping, the organs failing, the thing that happens at the end and that we mean when we say the word. He called that, borrowing the phrase deliberately from the Book of Revelation, the second death. And he proposed that there is another death, an earlier one that comes first, which he called the death of the spirit. The first death, the loss of the capacity to perform the complex behaviours that a complex social animal must be able to perform in order to remain that kind of animal. The capacity to court, to mate, to bond, to raise young, to defend a space, to hold a role, to be a functioning, contributing, connected part of a society. When those capacities die, Calhoun observed, the animal does not. It keeps living. It eats, it sleeps, it grooms itself, it persists. But it is, in the only sense that matters for the survival of its kind, already gone. The first death precedes the second. The spirit dies, and the body goes on without it, sometimes for a very long time, walking around the pen as though nothing whatsoever has happened. I told you, near the beginning, to hold on to a detail. The moment Calhoun looked at a peak, thriving, overflowing population and concluded that it was already dead. This is what he meant. He was not being merely poetic, or not only poetic, he had concluded, watching the behaviour, that the first death had already swept through the colony while the population was still growing, that the society was a corpse before the population count ever began to fall, and that everything that would follow, the long descending arithmetic of physical death, was simply the second death slowly catching up to the first. The thing he was looking at the peak, was the gap between the 2 deaths. A population that had already died in the way that counts, going through the motions of living in the way that does not. He was about to be proven right in the most total way an experiment can prove anything, because the population was about to stop growing entirely, and what came after the growth stopped is the part that even Calhoun, who had built 24 of these worlds and believed he knew what they did, was not fully prepared to witness. And before we go there, I will plant one more thing for you to carry, because it is the question the whole rest of the story turns on, and it is the question Calhoun could not stop asking himself. If the colony was dying because the world was broken, then the cure is obvious. You fix the world. You take a damaged animal out of the broken environment and you put it in a good one, a real one. A low-density world with space and roles and a fair chance, and it recovers. It must. That is what environments do. And so the question that hangs over everything that follows, the question Calhoun would eventually hand to a colleague and ask him to answer experimentally, is simply this: can it be undone? Once the first death has come for a generation, can a better world bring them back? Hold that. I will return to it, and the answer is the load-bearing fact of this entire story, and I am keeping it from you a little longer on purpose, because you need to see the end of the colony first. The population peaked at 2,200 mice. It reached that peak on day 560. And then, it never grew again. Not by one. From day 560 onward, in a sealed world with food enough for 9,500 and homes enough for nearly 4,000, the population of Universe 25 only ever went in one direction, which was down. That is the moment. Day 560. 2,200 animals, the largest population Calhoun had ever grown in any of his universes. The pen loud and packed and seething with life. And it was already, in every way that mattered, over. The last meaningful reproduction was essentially finished. A handful of young would still be born and survive in the immediate aftermath, the very last of them around day 600, but those were the tail end of a process that had already stopped. After day 600, in a population numbering more than 2,000 breeding-age adults, with everything in the world provided in endless supply, almost nothing was ever again successfully conceived, carried, born, and raised. A colony of more than 2,000 fertile animals quietly ceased to make a future. The births did not gradually taper toward some lower equilibrium. They stopped. The population had, while at its absolute maximum, lost the ability to replace itself, and it would now do nothing for the rest of its existence except slowly subtract. And the thing that grew while everything else withered, the thing that multiplied in the dead society as the births vanished, is the image from this experiment that lodged itself permanently in the culture and would not leave. The thing people remember even when they remember nothing else about it. Calhoun gave them a name, and the name is so gentle, so soft, so wrong, that it makes my skin crawl every time I write it. He called them the beautiful ones. In the final phase, a new kind of mouse appeared, in steadily growing numbers, and it was male, and it was, on the surface, the single healthiest looking animal in the entire universe. Sleek, unscarred, immaculately, perfectly groomed. These were the males born into the late stages, into the already dead society, who never entered the social world at all, not even to fail at it. They never fought, and so they carried no wounds, no scar tissue, no torn ears or bitten flanks. Which is precisely why their coats stayed flawless, why they were beautiful. They never courted a female, they never attempted to mate, they never sought status, never defended a territory, never engaged with another mouse in any way that carried social weight or social risk. Calhoun wrote that their behavioural repertoire became confined to eating, drinking, sleeping and grooming. That is the complete list. That is the entire content of the life. Eat, drink, sleep, and groom, and groom and groom. They were beautiful because they had withdrawn from everything that scars you. And everything that scars you, it turns out, is also everything that constitutes a life. I find the beautiful ones almost unbearable to think about, and I have tried to be honest with myself about exactly why, because it would be easy to make them a cheap metaphor, and I do not want to do that to them or to you. Here is what actually disturbs me about them, when I get underneath it. There is a kind of withdrawal that is suffering, that is visible pain, that is depression you can see and recognize and pity, an animal obviously in distress. That is not what these were. As far as anyone could tell, the beautiful ones were not suffering. They were not in distress. They had simply been born and raised inside a society so broken, so saturated with rejection and aimless violence, and failed, invaded, abandoned relationships that they had never formed the bonds, never been taught the behaviours, never developed the internal equipment for a social life, and so they had withdrawn into a perfect, placid, self-contained, undemanding existence that asked nothing of any other animal and offered nothing to any other animal, and would end childless, having touched no other life and left no trace. They were not in hell. That is the horror of them. They were comfortable. They were, by every measure of their own immediate moment-to-moment well-being, doing fine. Better than fine. They were the best groomed, least injured, most peaceful animals in the pen. And they were the end of the world wearing the face of the healthiest mouse in it. And here is a detail I came across that I have not been able to put down, because it closes a door I had been leaving hopefully open. You might assume, looking at these inert, grooming, beautiful animals, that something had gone physically wrong inside them, that they were neurologically damaged, deficient, broken at the level of the wiring, and that this brokenness explained the withdrawal. Researchers, including the biochemist Julius Axelrod, who held a Nobel Prize, looked at the brain chemistry of the beautiful ones, the catecholamines, the neurochemical machinery of motivation and stress and drive, and it looked broadly comparable to that of the active, territorial, fully functioning males. There was nothing obviously broken in there. The hardware for a complete mouse life was present, built, intact, operational. It had simply never been given the inputs. It had never been run through the developmental experiences that turn the raw capacity for a social life into an actual lived social life, and so it sat there, fully assembled, switched off, unused. They were not incapable in the sense of being damaged. They were incapable in the sense of never having been turned on. And there is no autopsy that reveals that, no scan that shows it, no chemistry that flags it. From the inside, from the wiring, from the blood, they looked like animals who could have lived full lives. They simply never did, and never would, and nothing in their bodies could tell you why. And that finding quietly demolishes the most comforting explanation available, the one I had been reaching for myself. Because if the beautiful ones had been visibly broken, if the chemistry had come back deranged, then the story would be a story about damage, about an environment that injured brains, and a damaged brain is at least a thing you can imagine repairing. But that is not what the work suggested. It suggested that the equipment was intact and simply never ran, that what was missing was not a part but an experience, the lived social development that converts a capable young animal into a participating adult one. There is a difference, and it is the most important difference in this entire story, between an animal that cannot and an animal that was never taught how. The first you might fix. The second has missed something that only comes once. And a creature that has missed it does not look injured. It looks instead perfect, calm, clean, unbothered. Well, the beautiful ones were not the wreckage of the collapse. They were its finished product, the thing the system was now manufacturing instead of mice. But the beautiful ones, as much as they are the unforgettable image of this experiment, are still only the symptom. They are what the first death looks like once it is finished, and walking around in a clean coat. The deeper question, the one that turns this from a tragedy into something closer to a verdict, is the question I planted a few minutes ago and asked you to hold, whether any of it could be undone. Because if the colony was dying purely of a broken environment, then the cure is simple and the catastrophe is not, in the deepest sense, permanent. You fix the environment. You take the damaged animals out and you put them somewhere good, and they heal, and they breed, and it turns out the whole thing was just a very bad situation that a better situation could reverse. Calhoun's colleague, a researcher named Halsey Marsden, ran exactly that experiment. He took survivors, animals drawn out of the dying universe, and moved them out of it into fresh enclosures at low density, with space, with safety, with everything they would need and the room to build the kind of structured, breeding, functioning society their own grandparents had built so easily, so naturally, back in Phase A, in that same kind of world, only a few hundred days earlier. He gave them, in effect, a second chance at existence, a fresh start, a do-over in paradise, the thing you would want for them, the thing that, if it worked, would mean that none of this was written in stone, that the first death was a condition and not a sentence, that a broken animal from a broken world could be made whole again by a whole one. I am going to come back to what happened to Marsden's rescued mice, and I am holding it deliberately, the same way Calhoun had to hold it, because what happened to them is the fact that decides what kind of story this actually is, whether it is a sad experiment about animals long ago, or a warning about a process that once it starts does not have an undo button. Hold the question with me a little longer. Can it be undone? Stay inside Universe 25 through its final phase first, because the end of the colony is something you need to see with your own eyes before you find out whether the end could ever have been prevented. Phase D. The death phase. After day 560, the population only fell, and it fell into a world that had become by then nearly incomprehensible as a society. The beautiful ones groomed in their growing pools, the withdrawn ones, the somnambulists, moved through the universe in their social comas, neither attacking nor mating nor relating, present without participating, ignored and ignoring. The few females still physically capable of conceiving mostly did not, and on the rare occasions when they did, the pregnancy was usually lost, or the litter destroyed or abandoned at birth. The behaviours that make a mouse in the species level sense, the courtship and the territoriality and the maternal care, the whole inherited repertoire on which the continuation of the line depends, were gone. And they were gone not because the animals were dead, because they were not, but because the animals had never learned them, and there was no longer anyone left alive who could teach them, and no functioning society left in which to learn them. This is the part where I have to name the mechanism directly, plainly, because it is the most important thing in the entire collapse, and it is the part that makes the whole thing irreversible, and it is the exact part that the overcrowding legend erases completely. The young born into Phase C and Phase D were rejected too early. Driven from the nest before weaning, attacked by their own overwhelmed mothers, abandoned on the open floor, they never received the protected developmental window in which a young mammal learns how to be a member of its own kind. And this is the key biological fact underneath everything. A mouse is not born knowing how to court, how to fight for status, how to mother, how to bond. It learns those behaviours in infancy and adolescence from a functioning social environment through relationships and bonds that can only form during a narrow critical period early in life. Break the environment during that window, deny the young animal the bonds and the modelling and the safe practice, and the learning simply never happens. And once that window closes, it does not reopen. The animal grows up, physically mature, with intact hardware, and the behaviours that should have been installed during childhood are not there, and it is too late, structurally, developmentally, permanently too late, for them ever to be installed. So the dying universe was producing animals that were, in the deepest possible sense, untrained, not stupid, not brain damaged. Untrained in the precise and narrow set of social and reproductive skills required to continue the species, in a way that could no longer be corrected after the fact by any change of circumstance. And those untrained animals could not produce a next generation, because they did not possess the behaviour with which to do it, and so the population could do nothing but decline. And as it declined, the survivors aged, and the last fertile females aged out of fertility, the final conceptions trailing off somewhere around day 920, in a colony whose youngest members were already, every one of them, incapable of building anything at all. After that, it was pure subtraction, old animals dying and nothing ever replacing them. A long, quiet arithmetic running steadily down towards zero in a sealed box in Maryland, with the food hoppers still full and the water bottles still flowing and most of the apartments still empty. And Calhoun, being a precise man, a man who had been calculating the fates of marked individuals since he was a boy in a Tennessee field, did the final arithmetic. He took the age structure of what remained, the dwindling population of aging, non-breeding, socially dead animals, and he calculated forward to the date on which the last male would die. He put it at the 23rd of May, 1973, 1,780 days after he had opened the door and placed 8 healthy mice into a perfect world. And the colony obeyed his arithmetic, descended along the curve he had drawn, down into silence, almost exactly as written. An entire society, given everything, going extinct precisely on schedule, calculable in advance, the date of the end fixed before the last animals were even gone, in a heaven with the supplies still stocked. There is something about that calculation that I keep returning to, because of what it requires to be true. To put a date on the death of the last animal, years out, and be right, you have to be looking at a system that has lost all of its freedom. A living, striving, reproducing population is unpredictable, because at any moment it might do the thing that living systems do: surprise you, adapt, recover, find a way. You cannot put a firm date on the extinction of something that still has options. The only reason Calhoun could calculate the end was that the population no longer had any. Every animal that would ever be born had, in effect, already been born. No new behaviour was going to emerge, because the animals capable of new behaviour had not been raised. The outcome had collapsed from a range of possibilities down to a single line on a graph, and a single line is the signature of a thing that is no longer alive in the way that matters, only winding down. That is what it means to say the colony was already dead at its peak. It means the future had stopped branching. It had become a calculation, and a society whose future has become a calculation, whose demographers can tell you with quiet confidence the shape of the next 80 years because nothing the living members do will change it, is a society that has, in the sense Calhoun meant, already received its verdict, whatever the population counter happens to read on the day you look. Now, Calhoun being Calhoun, he did not describe what he had witnessed as a population dynamics curve. He reached for older and larger language, because he had concluded that the language of numbers was not big enough to hold the thing he had seen. In the paper he wrote about all of this, which he delivered as an address before the Royal Society of Medicine in London on the 22nd of June. 1972, and published the following January, he built a small, grim, almost theological piece of arithmetic out of the 2 deaths, and he gave the paper a title to match. He took the second death, the death of the body, ordinary mortality, and he noted that he had drastically reduced it, very nearly eliminated it, by building a world with no predators, no disease, no famine, no cold. He had, in effect, killed mortality, and then he reasoned that killing mortality, the death of the second death, was, in his phrase, death squared. And that death squared, by removing the very pressures that organise a society, by removing the scarcity and danger that make roles and striving and structure necessary, leads inevitably to the dissolution of the social order, and that the dissolution of the social order leads in turn to the death of the spirit, the first death. And so, by his own bitter equation, the elimination of death, complete, total, kindly meant, was the thing that caused the deeper death. The paradise was the murder weapon, and the mechanism by which it killed was that it was simply too good. remove every reason to die, and you remove every reason to live, because in a social animal the two are built out of the same material. He titled the paper Death Squared, and as a kind of epigraph he placed his own equation, working through it line by line, from the death of the second death, to the death of the establishment, to the death of the spirit, the first death, laid out like a proof. Think for a moment about the room he delivered that in. The Royal Society of Medicine, London, the summer of 1972, an audience of physicians and scientists who had come, presumably, to hear about rodent population dynamics, and who instead were handed an equation that ended in the death of the spirit, and an epigraph drawn from the Book of Revelation, by a soft-spoken American telling them in so many words that he was not actually talking about mice, and that the same arithmetic was running, right then, underneath their own civilization. It is one of the stranger documents in the history of 20th century science, a paper that reads in places like a laboratory report and in places like a sermon, and it sits in the published record of a serious medical society, and you can read it today. And the reception is its own small lesson. The diagnosis half, the mice, the behavioural sink, the beautiful ones, was received, repeated, anthologized, turned into the cultural property it remains. The other half, the part where a respected scientist looked a room of his peers in the eye and told them the experiment was a model of human extinction by abundance, was received the way a dinner party receives a guest who has said something true and unbearable, with a polite silence and a change of subject, and a quiet collective decision never to bring it up again. He had told them exactly what he thought it meant. He could not have been clearer, and the precise clarity of it is part of why it was so efficiently ignored, because a vague warning can be absorbed and discussed, but a specific one, with an equation and a date and a claim about your own species, can only be either acted upon or refused, and acting on it was unthinkable, so it was refused. Smoothly, completely, by simply declining to repeat the half that hurt. And he opened that paper, in its very first lines, with a sentence that tells you, beyond any possibility of mistake, that he had never once, not for a single day, been talking about mice. He wrote that he would largely speak of mice, but that his thoughts were on man, on healing, on life and its evolution. His thoughts were on man. That is the sentence the entire experiment was built over decades to deliver, and it is the sentence that turned John Calhoun from a respected federal scientist into, depending entirely on who you asked, either a prophet or an embarrassment, with very little room in between, because he did not believe he had discovered something about the behaviour of rodents. He believed he had discovered something about complex social animals as a category, a class to which he believed, explicitly, on the record, repeatedly, human beings belong. And he stated, in the paper in plain language, that for an animal as complex as man there is no logical reason why a comparable sequence of events should not also lead to species extinction. That is the claim. There it is. And the instant you take it seriously, even just seriously enough to want to argue with it, you run straight into the obvious objection, the one you have almost certainly been holding since the first time I said the word mice, the sensible, reasonable, reassuring objection that lets a person put this story down and go to sleep at night. People are not mice, and that objection is correct, and it is important, and I am going to spend real time on it, and it does not save you, and the precise place where it breaks down is more disturbing than the experiment itself. But before we can get there, you need to understand what happened to the man, because the story of how the scientific establishment handled John Calhoun is its own small, quiet, ugly demonstration of a society withdrawing from something it found uncomfortable, and once you have seen it happen to him, you will not be able to stop seeing the same shape everywhere else. For a while, he was a star. The behavioural sink had made him genuinely famous, and the overpopulation panic of the era gave his work enormous cultural resonance. And through the 1960s and into the 70s, he was the kind of scientist who got invited into the rooms where the future was discussed. At NIM, he was part of an interdisciplinary group formed in the mid-1950s around a psychiatrist named Leonard Dull that was half-jokingly called the Space Cadets. A circle of architects and planners and psychiatrists and biologists who met regularly to think about how the physical environment, the built world of buildings and streets and crowds, shapes the human mind. That work was not fringe. It fed directly into the way an entire generation of planners and architects came to think about designing for psychological well-being, into the field of personal space, into the assumption, which we now take for granted, that the shape of the environment is a mental health variable. He advised committees. He consulted on the design of institutions. He met the Pope in 1974. His mice had escaped the laboratory and colonized the imagination of a civilization. And he was, by the accounts of people who worked with him, a genuinely strange and compelling presence to have in such a room. Soft-spoken, courtly, carrying a Tennessee accent he never lost, given to enormous hand-drawn diagrams in which arrows looped from rodent demography to human history to theology and back again. A man who could hold a room full of architects and psychiatrists rapt, while he explained why a barn full of mice was, in truth, a working-scale model of the fate of cities. He thought in centuries and in symbols. He named his concepts with a kind of deliberate biblical weight: the behavioural sink, the beautiful ones, the first death, death squared, because he did not experience what he was doing as the dry accumulation of data. He experienced it as the uncovering of a law that applied to everything that lived in groups, his own species and his own civilization emphatically included, and he could not understand why everyone around him was not as alarmed as he was. That intensity was exactly what made him magnetic in the 1960s, when the culture was primed and eager to be alarmed about the future. It was also, precisely, the thing that would make him impossible to fund in the 1980s, when the culture quietly decided it would rather not be. And here is the irony that I find almost too clean to be real, except that it is real, and documented and sad. Calhoun did not think his work was a prophecy of doom. He thought it was a warning that came packaged with a cure, and he spent the entire back half of his career, the part that essentially nobody remembers, working, obsessively, almost desperately on the way out. He had noticed something in his colonies that gave him hope. He had noticed that genuine innovation, novel behaviour, new solutions tended to come not from the dominant, successful, well-adjusted animals at the top of the order, but from the odd ones, the deviants, the outsiders pushed to the margins, the ones who, having no secure place in the existing structure, sometimes stumbled into entirely new ways of doing things. Out of pathology, occasionally, came progress, and he built whole later experiments trying to engineer worlds that would foster exactly that creative deviance, that would give a crowded, role-saturated population a way to expand not into physical space, which was finite and sealed, but into what he called conceptual space, which was not finite at all. He came to believe that the human escape from the behavioural sink, the thing that might genuinely make us different from his mice, was our singular capacity to keep inventing new roles, new ideas, new dimensions of meaning to grow into whenever the physical and social frontiers closed against us. When you cannot expand outward, he thought, you might still expand into ideas, into culture, into mind, into an endlessly enlarging conceptual space, and that expansion might be the thing that keeps the structure alive when there is no more territory to win. This was not a vague hope. He worked at it like an engineer. He ran later universes in which he deliberately complicated the environment, added difficulty, added things to do, tried to manufacture roles and challenges where his earlier paradises had offered none, testing whether a population given problems to solve would hold together where a population given pure ease had dissolved. He became convinced that the lethal ingredient had never been the density and never been the abundance on their own, but the combination of abundance with the absence of anything meaningful left to do, the state of having every need met and every role filled and every frontier closed, and he thought the human answer had to be the endless manufacture of new frontiers that were not physical. He turned near the end to the writer H.G. Wells, and to Wells's old dream of what Wells had called a world brain. A permanent global encyclopedia, a networked collective intelligence that would let humanity keep thinking and inventing its way into new conceptual room forever. Calhoun tried to build a working seed of it himself, assembling the contributions of 162 collaborators from around the world into a single cross-referenced compendium, a clumsy paper and index prototype of a thing he could clearly see coming and would not live to use. People who read those late writings now sometimes feel a small chill, because what he was describing, decades early, in the language of a mid-century biologist, is recognisably the internet, the very thing that would arrive after his death and become, depending on the hour and the platform, either the conceptual frontier he prayed for or the behavioural sink he warned against, and which now appears, more and more, to be both at once. He drew on the writer H.G. Wells, on Wells's old dream of a world brain, and imagined a kind of global, interconnected network of human minds and machines that would let a crowded humanity keep growing into ideas forever. Keep generating the new roles and new meanings that a static, sealed, abundant world otherwise strangles. He built an early version of it himself, a vast index compilation drawing together the work of 162 different contributors into a single integrated database, a physical, paper and cross-reference prototype of a thing he could see coming. Some people, looking back at those writings now, think he was half describing the internet, decades before it arrived. He had, in other words, a genuinely hopeful theory of the human future. He had a doomsday, the mice, and opposite it, deliberately, he had what he actually named a dawnsday, the way out, the expansion into mind. And the establishment and the public took the doomsday and threw the dawnsday in the trash. The historians who have studied his reception most carefully, Edmund Ramsden and John Adams, put it in a single line that I think is one of the truest things ever written about how science meets the public, and it applies to far more than Calhoun. Everyone wanted to hear the diagnosis. No one wanted to hear the cure. The crowded, violent, dying, cannibalizing mice were unforgettable, cinematic, quotable, perfectly shaped to confirm what people already feared. The careful, hopeful, complicated, demanding argument about how a complex society might save itself through creativity and the expansion of conceptual space was, by comparison, unbearably boring. And so it vanished without a trace, and Calhoun was left as the Mouse Doom guy, the author of a horror story, the man whose name you invoke when you want to scare someone about the future, his actual life's project, the part he cared about most and worked hardest on, simply unread. That, right there, is the first death of an idea. The idea kept walking around. People kept citing it, kept invoking it, kept making films and comics and creepypastas out of it. It just was not really alive anymore. The thing Calhoun actually meant had died, and the husk of it went on grooming itself in the culture, beautiful and empty, for decades. And then the literal funding died, which is where the institutional story turns from sad to almost unbearable. By the early 1980s, American psychiatric research had pivoted hard, decisively, away from environment and behaviour and society, and toward chemistry. Toward drugs. The new and ascendant paradigm held that mental suffering was fundamentally a problem of molecules in the brain, to be diagnosed as chemical imbalance and corrected with chemical intervention, and the slow, messy, expensive, hard to monetize study of how environments and social structures shape minds fell out of fashion almost overnight, defunded and deprioritized across the field. There is a line attributed to a senior NIM administrator around 1981 that captures the whole brutal turn in 3 words. NIM, he reportedly said, is drugs, period. It is worth being forensically specific about that turn. Because it was not a whim, and it was not aimed at Calhoun personally, which is exactly what makes it such a clean example of the thing he spent his life describing. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association published the 3rd edition of its diagnostic manual, the document the field would run on for a generation, and it represented a decisive victory for a biological, symptom checklist model of mental illness over the older, messier models that took environment and social context seriously. Funding, prestige, careers, and pharmaceutical money all flowed the same direction at once, toward the molecule and away from the world. A new antidepressant was a few years from launch that would make that model not just intellectually dominant, but enormously profitable. None of this required anyone to decide that Calhoun was wrong. Nobody refuted him. There was no committee that examined Universe 25 and found an error. The field simply turned its whole body toward a different, more tractable, more fundable, more marketable question, and a man whose entire life's work argued that the suffering was in the structure of the world and not in the chemistry of the isolated skull found himself standing, mid-sentence, in a room that had quietly emptied. That is how an uncomfortable truth actually dies in a modern institution, not by refutation, by reallocation. The grant line closes, the students go where the money is, the citations thin, and the idea is left talking to an empty room, still correct, still unfunded, still walking around. The first death, again, this time performed on a body of knowledge by the institution that was supposed to keep it alive. Sit with the position that put Calhoun in. A man whose entire life's work was the argument that mental and social pathology grows out of the structure of the world we build, out of roles and relationships and the design of environments, rather than out of a private chemical imbalance to be corrected in an individual skull, was now employed inside an institution that had decided, as official policy, that it was drugs, period. His funding dried up. His contract was terminated in 1983, 1 year before the long research cycle he was then running would have completed, and, with a timing so cruel it sounds like something a novelist would reject as too neat, just short of the year 1984. And Calhoun, who knew his Orwell intimately, felt the date land on him with full force. He began, in his private writing, to cast himself as Winston Smith, the man in Orwell's 1984 who keeps trying to tell the truth inside a system engineered to make that particular truth unspeakable. He drafted manuscripts with parallel timelines running side by side down the page, Orwell's fictional history, the history of Nim, and the history of his own life. The 3 columns rhyming with one another, and somewhere in those late private papers he wrote a short, flat, devastating note. 1986, he wrote, is 1984. And then, beneath it, 3 words. It is finished. He resigned. He spent his final years on idiosyncratic, unfinished, increasingly private projects, including a science fiction novel about a future being, a post-human species deliberately bred to survive the very apocalypse his mice had modelled, a kind of fictional answer to the question of whether anything could come through the collapse on the other side. He never finished it. He died of a stroke following a heart attack on the 7th of September 1995 at the age of 78, while travelling with his wife in Hanover, New Hampshire. His papers went to the National Library of Medicine, boxes of them, the diagnosis and the discarded cure together in the dark. And here is the parallel that I cannot stop turning over, because it is so exact that it feels designed, and it was not. It just happened. The man who built a world with no scarcity, who spent his entire life studying what happens to a population when its every material need is met in endless supply, died after his own single most important need, the resources to finish his work, was taken away from him by an institution that had simply lost interest in what he had to say. He engineered universe after universe of infinite supply, and he died of a shortage. He spent decades warning the world about the death of the spirit that precedes the death of the body, and he watched his own life's central idea suffer exactly that fate, the first death, reduced to a walking husk of a horror meme while he was still alive to see it walk. I do not think you could write that as fiction. An editor would tell you it was too on the nose to be believed. His mice, meanwhile, had children of their own in the culture that long outlived their reputation. In 1971, the writer Robert O'Brien published a children's novel, Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim, about hyper-intelligent rats who escape a laboratory at the National Institute of Mental Health and try to build their own self-sufficient society, a direct, if softened and hopeful, descendant of Calhoun's work, later made into the animated film The Secret of Nim. Generations of children absorbed a gentle echo of the experiment without ever knowing its source or its ending. The dying universe in Maryland seeded everything from dystopian science fiction to comic books, the artists drawn again and again to the diagnosis, and again leaving the cure, and the man. Behind so, people are not mice. Let us finally deal with it properly, because this is the place where I have to be most careful and most honest, and it is also the place where the story stops being something that happened to a man and some animals a long time ago and becomes something about the device in your hand and the street outside your window. The strongest and most serious criticisms of Calhoun's work are not the lazy dismissals, and I am not going to insult you with the lazy version. They are real, and they deserve more weight than most of the conclusions people draw from the experiment. The first is simply that his specific dramatic results have never been cleanly replicated. There is no library of confirming experiments standing behind Universe 25. Wild rat and mouse populations do not, in general, produce the full lurid cast of characters, the probers and the somnambulists and the beautiful ones, that Calhoun's sealed worlds produced. And, as I mentioned, toward the end he had largely stopped submitting his work to peer review, convinced that what he had to say was too urgent to wait for the slow machinery of journals, which is precisely the move a scientist is not supposed to make, and which made his work very easy to set aside. A single, unreplicated, decades-old experiment run by a man who came to see himself as a prophet is not a law of nature, and anyone who presents it to you as one is overselling. And you should hold all of this loosely. I mean that. Hold it loosely. There is a third criticism, and it is the most directly relevant of all, because it tested the human claim head-on, and it cut against Calhoun. In the 1970s, while Calhoun's rats were at the height of their cultural fame, a psychologist named Jonathan Friedman set out to find the behavioural sink in actual human beings. He ran experiments crowding people into small rooms to perform tasks, and he looked hard at the populations of dense cities against less dense ones, expecting, given the spirit of the age, to find Calhoun's pathologies written across human society. He did not find them. His work, published around 1975, concluded that density itself had no consistent general, harmful effect on human beings, that crowded people were not reliably more aggressive or more broken than uncrowded ones, and that the whole rat-to-city extrapolation had outrun the evidence, and he was, on his own terms, right. Packing humans into a city does not turn them into Calhoun's rats. The naive version of the parallel, more bodies per square mile equals social collapse, is simply false, and it has been known to be false for 50 years, and you should know it too. Density alone does not do it. If the story ended there, you could close it in peace, but notice what Friedman was measuring and what he was not, because the gap between those two things is the entire game. He was measuring physical density, people per room, people per acre, the crude variable. He was testing the overcrowding hypothesis, the very hypothesis that, as we have already established, was never actually the mechanism, not even in the mice. He was, in other words, debunking the legend, and the legend deserved debunking. What he was not measuring, because in 1975 there was no way to measure it and nothing yet to measure, was the other thing. The volume of forced, involuntary, inescapable social contact, decoupled entirely from physical proximity. In 1975, you could not yet be alone in a room and simultaneously drowning in 10,000 other minds. The technology to deliver Calhoun's actual mechanism, saturation without proximity, the sink without the crowd, had not been invented. Friedman tested the only version available to him and disproved it, and in doing so he accidentally cleared away the wrong hypothesis and left the dangerous one standing, untested, waiting for the decade when the machine that could finally deliver it would be placed into every human hand on Earth. But the second serious criticism is the deepest one, and it comes from those same historians, Ramsden and Adams, who studied Calhoun and his archive more carefully than almost anyone alive, and it does not so much debunk the work as relocate the horror to a new and worse address. They argue that the popular reading, the overcrowding reading, gets the mechanism wrong in a way that matters enormously, and that the real lesson is both more specific and more unsettling than too many bodies in too little space. The mice and the rats, they point out, did not collapse simply because there were many of them in a confined area. Raw density was not the killer. What broke them was something more particular and more recognizable. It was the sheer, ceaseless volume of forced, unavoidable, unwanted social interaction. In the wild, an animal that does not want to interact can leave. It can hold and defend a territory, control who it encounters, regulate its own social load, retreat when it needs to retreat. In Calhoun's sealed worlds, you could never get away from each other. Every animal was constantly subjected to encounters it had not chosen and could not escape, a relentless, grinding, involuntary social contact with no off switch and no exit. And, crucially, the animals who did manage to secure control over their own space, the dominant ones who held real defensible territory, actually did relatively well, lived relatively normal lives, bred, as Ramsden put it. Not all of Calhoun's rats had gone berserk. The ones who could control their space were fine. The pathology was concentrated, overwhelmingly, in the ones who could not. The ones drowning in involuntary contact, the ones with no ability to opt out of the crowd. Now, almost everyone who reaches for this criticism deploys it as a comfort. It was never really about abundance or population at all, they say. It was about a weird artificial cage where the animals were trapped in constant forced contact, which has nothing whatsoever to do with us, so we can all relax. And that is exactly, dangerously, backwards. That is the single most reassuring and most wrong conclusion available in this entire story, and I want to be completely direct about why. Because if you take only one thing from all of this, take this. Look at what the refined diagnosis actually says. Stripped of the false comfort, the thing that destroys a complex social animal is not having too little. It is being saturated with constant, involuntary, inescapable social contact that it did not choose and cannot turn off. Being permanently surrounded, being unable to control the flow of other minds into its own, being denied the ability to retreat, to hold a private space, to regulate how much of everyone else it has to absorb in a given hour. Read that again, slowly, and then ask yourself, honestly, what is the device sitting within arm's reach of you right now? Ask yourself what it actually feels like to be reachable at every hour by everyone you have ever met, to scroll past the unfiltered thoughts of 1,000 strangers before you have finished your first coffee, to never be able to fully log off, to carry the entire churning, arguing, performing crowd of the species in your pocket and into your bed and into the last waking minute of your night. A writer at the New Yorker, trying recently to describe what a certain enormous social platform had become, landed on a phrase. The most accurate description, they wrote, was a behavioural sink. They were not reaching for a clever metaphor. They were reaching for the exactly correct technical term, coined in a barn in Maryland in 1958. For a population drawn into a density of forced, involuntary interaction so total that the ordinary regulation of social life simply stops functioning. The criticism does not save us. The criticism describes us. We did not avoid Calhoun's cage. We built a better one, an invisible one, a portable one, and we carry it with us everywhere, and we cannot put it down. And it is open every hour of every day, and there is no territory inside it that anyone can hold or defend, and no wall high enough to retreat behind, and no exit, because the exit would mean disappearing from the only social world that increasingly counts. The version of the science that is supposedly more reassuring, the version that rules out crude physical crowding, is the version that should genuinely keep you awake, because the only thing it rules out is the one and only thing we have actually solved. Physical density. We are not physically crowded. The developed world has more space and more wealth, and more privacy, and more square footage per person than any humans who have ever lived. What we have instead, what we have manufactured and handed to ourselves and our children, is the other thing. The inescapable, involuntary, total social saturation. The thing that actually did the killing. And this is where I have to set down the part of all this that I keep wanting to flinch away from, because the numbers are real, and they are current, and they describe, with a precision that I find difficult to sit with for very long, the early phases of the exact sequence Calhoun mapped. Not the violence. I am going to be completely honest with you about the violence. The violence does not match, and I will come back to that, because intellectual honesty demands it, and because the place where the pattern breaks is itself a clue worth more than 100 places where it fits. But the other markers, the withdrawal, the breeding, those are not speculation, and they are not coincidence, and they are not from 1973, they are from this year. Start with the breeding, because it is the cleanest and the most alarming and the hardest to argue away. The single number that determines whether a population continues to exist at all is the total fertility rate, the average number of children a woman has across her lifetime, and the number a population needs simply to hold steady, to replace itself, to neither grow nor shrink across the generations, is about 2.1. Below that, sustained for long enough, and a population does precisely what Universe 25 did after day 560. It stops making a future. It enters the long, quiet subtraction. South Korea, one of the wealthiest, most technologically advanced, most materially comfortable societies that has ever existed on the surface of this planet, has a total fertility rate, according to the most recent figures from Statistics Korea, of 0.75. Not 2. Not 1. 0.75. In the capital, in Seoul, it is around 0.64. To put that in the plainest possible terms, with no spin on it, each successive generation of Koreans is on track to be roughly a third the size of the one before it. That is not a gentle demographic adjustment. That is a population in free fall, in a country with no famine, no war, no plague, no scarcity of any kind whatsoever. A country that has, by every material measure, everything, falling out of existence faster than almost any society in recorded human history, voluntarily, in the middle of overwhelming plenty. Let me make that rate of decline as concrete as the doubling was. A fertility rate of 0.75 means that for roughly every 100 Koreans of one generation, there will be about 36 in the next, and about 13 in the one after that. Run it forward and 100 great-grandparents are succeeded by something like 5 great-grandchildren. There are towns in South Korea where no baby has been born in years, where the maternity ward closed for lack of use and the elementary school closed after it, where the youngest resident is in late middle age, whole communities sliding quietly into a condition with no precedent in a healthy nation. The slow inversion of a population from a pyramid into a spindle into nothing. And here is the part that connects it directly back to the pen. The fastest declines are not in the poorest places, where you might expect children to be an unaffordable luxury. They are in the richest, safest, most developed, most comfortable places. Seoul, the glittering capital, has the lowest rate in the country at around 0.64. The wealthier the district, the fewer the children. The relationship between abundance and the refusal to reproduce is not subtle, and it is not hidden. It runs, across nation after nation, in exactly the direction Calhoun's equation predicted, the direction that says the removal of every pressure is itself the pressure that ends the line. The richer we make the world, the faster the youngest cohorts shrink, and we have spent the entire modern project making the world richer as fast as we possibly can, certain the whole time that we were building a paradise. And it is very far from only Korea. Japan sits around 1.2, Italy around 1.2, Spain, Greece, much of southern and eastern Europe, the same. China, the most populous nation in the history of the species, has fallen to somewhere around 1, and has already begun, as of the last couple of years, to shrink in absolute terms for the first time in generations. Across essentially the entire developed world, the same curve bends the same way, and the pattern is consistent enough to be eerie. The wealthier, the safer, the more abundant and comfortable and provided for a society becomes, the harder and faster its birth rate falls. The United States recently hit an all-time low, with a total fertility rate that the Centers for Disease Control put at roughly 1.6, well below replacement, and still drifting downward. And the global rate, the entire human species average together, has fallen to around 2.25, now barely above replacement, and the United Nations now projects that human population will peak. For the first time in the entire history of our kind, somewhere in the middle of the 2080s, at around 10.3 billion, and then begin, for the first time ever, to decline. We are, as a species, approaching our own day 560, the day the number stops going up. The peak that, in the only universe we have ever been able to watch, run all the way to the end, was not a plateau, but a turning point. The visible top of a thing that had already, invisibly, died. I need to be scrupulously, almost painfully fair here, because this is exactly the point at which a dishonest version of this story would cheat, and you deserve far better than the cheat, and the honest version is more unsettling anyway. There are completely human, completely non-spooky, completely sufficient explanations for falling fertility, and they are real, and I am not going to pretend they are not. The education of women and their full entry into the workforce and public life. The enormous expense in time and money of raising children in a modern economy, reliable contraception, and the freedom to plan and choose, the collapse of the old brutal economic logic in which children were farm labour and old age insurance. Urbanisation, the price of housing, these are not mysteries, and they are not pathologies, and an enormous share of the fertility decline is simply people, and especially women, gaining the freedom and the means and the good reasons to make different choices than their grandmothers were ever permitted to make, and that freedom is a genuinely, unambiguously good thing that I am not going to insult by calling it a disease. Calhoun's mice had no housing market, no gender revolution, no contraceptive pill, no career, no choice at all. The mechanism in the pen cannot be identical to the mechanism in the city. Anyone who tells you that the falling human birth rate is simply our species mindlessly running the mouse program is overselling badly, and you should distrust them on contact. And yet, here is the residue, the part that the entirely reasonable economic explanations do not quite reach, the thing left at the bottom of the glass after you have poured off everything that has a tidy cause. Calhoun's deepest claim was never actually about birth rates as a number. The birth rate was a symptom, the last and most measurable one. His claim was about the death of the spirit. The first death, the loss of the drive and the capacity to engage in the complex social behaviours out of which a full life is actually built. The courtship and the pair bonding and the construction of a shared future with another person. And the withdrawal, instead, into a comfortable, self-contained, undemanding, beautifully groomed existence that asks nothing and offers nothing and ends having touched no other. Life. And when you stop looking at the birth rate as a number and start looking at the behaviours underneath it, the residue, the part the economists cannot fully account for, the picture stops looking like a rational and liberating response to incentives and starts looking like something colder, something with a familiar shape. In Japan, there is a word, Hikikomori, coined by the psychiatrist Tamaki Saito in 1998, for people who have withdrawn almost completely from social life, who do not work and do not study, who often do not leave their homes, sometimes do not leave a single room, for 6 months, for years, in some documented cases for decades, until an aging parent dies and the withdrawn child, now themselves middle-aged, is discovered alone. For a long time this was thought to be a small and marginal phenomenon, a few 100,000 troubled young men. Then the Japanese government conducted a proper, broad, all-ages survey in late 2022, and the estimate that came back was roughly 1.46 million working-age people, 1.5 million human beings, in a wealthy, safe, orderly, materially abundant society, who have simply stepped out of the social world entirely, who eat and sleep and exist and groom and ask nothing of anyone and offer nothing to anyone and will, a great many of them, touch no other life and leave no descendant. I told you much earlier that the beautiful ones were almost unbearable to think about. I did not tell you until now that we have a word for them, and a government survey, and a number, and that the number is 1.5 million in one country and rising, and that it has its own steadily climbing demographic, the aging Hikikomori and their aging parents, that the Japanese have a grim shorthand for. And watch what the number does over time, because the trajectory is its own argument. When the Japanese government first tried to count, the phenomenon was treated as something that happened to young men, a youth problem, a failure to launch that people assumed the young would eventually grow out of. They did not grow out of it, they aged inside it. By the later surveys, the government had to widen the age bands upward, again and again, because the withdrawn 20-somethings of one decade had become the withdrawn 40-somethings of the next, without ever once rejoining the world, and a new and quietly horrifying category appeared in the social services vocabulary: the situation in which an elderly parent in their 80s is still caring for and supporting a withdrawn child in their 50s, two people aging together in a sealed house, the younger one never having entered the society outside the door, the older one terrified of what happens to that child when the parent dies. That is not a snapshot. That is a phase advancing. The first survey caught the front edge of it, and each subsequent count has found it larger and older, the withdrawal not reversing with maturity but hardening into a permanent way of being, a generation that opted out early and could not, or would not, opt back in, exactly the pattern the rescued mice showed when Marsden tried to bring them back, the capacity to rejoin simply gone, not refused, gone. We will get to those mice very soon now. Hold them, and it is not only Japan, though Japan, being a society that measures itself carefully and honestly, gives us the clearest numbers. The Surgeon General of the United States issued a formal public health advisory in 2023 declaring loneliness and social isolation an epidemic, and the language in that document is not soft and it is not hedged. Chronic social disconnection, the advisory states, carries a mortality risk comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, greater than the risk associated with obesity. And it found that among young people in particular, the amount of time spent physically, in person with friends, had dropped by something on the order of 70% over roughly 2 decades. Sit with that comparison for a second longer than is comfortable, because the public health establishment does not hand out comparisons like that lightly. They are telling you that being chronically alone is, in its effect on how long you live, in the same category as a serious daily smoking habit, and worse than carrying dangerous excess weight. 2 things our entire medical culture is organised around screaming at people to avoid. We have public campaigns, warning labels, taxes, and decades of relentless messaging aimed at cigarettes and at obesity. We have, against the thing the same authorities now rank alongside them, almost nothing, because the thing in question does not look like a hazard. It looks like a quiet evening in. It looks like a young person content in their room, online, fed, warm, entertained, safe and alone, and reporting if you ask them that they are fine. The advisory was trying, in the cautious language available to a government document, to raise an alarm about a way of living that produces no visible suffering in the moment and a mortality curve like a cigarette in the long run, which is to say it was trying to make people frightened of comfort, and comfort is the one thing no population has ever learned to be frightened of in time, and that 70% figure deserves its own breath. In the space of a single generation, the young people of the most technologically connected society in the history of the world cut their actual, physical, in the same room time with one another by nearly 3/4, while the devices in their hands assured them, hour by hour, notification by notification, that they were more connected than any humans had ever been. And the rate at which young adults report having no romantic or sexual relationships at all has climbed steadily, year after year, the phenomenon now widely called the sex recession, with surveys finding that something like 1/4 of young adults report no sexual activity in a given year, a figure that has been rising for over a decade. In lockstep, the data suggest, with screen time and withdrawal, and the quiet, frictionless replacement of human contact with its glowing digital ghost. And I can already hear the most reasonable objection to all of this. And it deserves an answer, because it is the same objection that lets people wave away the fertility numbers, and it is genuinely strong. People are choosing this, the objection goes. Nobody is forcing a young person to stay home, to swipe instead of meet, to scroll instead of call, to opt out of dating and marriage and children. These are free choices made by free people who have weighed their options and prefer it this way. And who are you, or Calhoun, or a government advisory, to call a freely chosen life a pathology? And that is fair, and I want to take it seriously rather than dismiss it, because the line between a free choice and a behavioural sink is exactly the line this entire story is about. So here is the honest answer. Calhoun's mice were also, in the only sense available to a mouse, choosing. Nothing forced the rejected males into their inert pools. Nothing dragged the beautiful ones to the grooming spots. Nothing held a female back from breeding. There was no external compulsion anywhere in that pen. Every animal did exactly what it preferred to do in each moment. Given what it was and how it had been raised, and what it preferred increasingly was withdrawal, ease, the avoidance of the friction and risk and rejection that a full social life requires. That is the entire horror of the behavioural sink. It is not imposed. It is preferred. It is what beings raised in a particular kind of abundance come to want, freely. Each step feeling like a perfectly reasonable individual choice, the sum of those free choices being the quiet end of the line. A trap that worked by force would be easy to see and easy to resist. This one works by preference, which is why nobody resists it, which is why it works. And the rate at which young adults report withdrawing from one another keeps climbing regardless of the explanation we prefer for it. Withdrawal, childlessness, the collapse of pair bonding, the retreat into comfortable, self-contained, undemanding solitude in the middle of historically unprecedented abundance and historically unprecedented forced connection. I am not telling you these are the same thing as the mice. I am telling you that if you handed John Calhoun this data, today, with the species labels stripped off, and asked him which phase of which universe it described, I do not think he would hesitate for as long as a breath. And, if you are honest, I do not think you would either. Now the honesty I promised you, the place where the pattern breaks, because hiding it would make me exactly the kind of person this whole story is an indictment of, the kind who takes the satisfying diagnosis and quietly buries the inconvenient part. The violence does not match. Calhoun's collapse was loud. It was aggression and probing and cannibalism and chaos and the constant motiveless weather of attack moving through the pools of the rejected. Our decline, if that is even what it is silent. Crime, including violent crime, has broadly fallen, not risen, across the wealthy, low-fertility societies over the same decades. Japan and Korea and Italy are not violent places. They are among the safest, most orderly, most peaceful societies that have ever existed. So if you are searching for the marauding, deranged, blood in the corridors version of Universe 25 in the modern world, you will not find it, and anyone who tells you that you can is lying to you to make a point, and you should walk away from them. But sit with what that absence actually means, because I have turned it over many times and I do not find it reassuring in the slightest. It might mean the analogy is simply broken, that we are nothing like the mice after all, that the resemblance is a spooky coincidence dressed up as a warning, and that you can close this and forget it and sleep perfectly well. That is genuinely possible, and I want to leave it honestly fully on the table because it might be the truth, and I would rather it were. Or it might mean that we have skipped a phase, that the violence in Calhoun's worlds was the death throes of animals who still had drives, still had energy, still had something hot and unspent pushing at them even when it had nowhere to go, and that what we have done with our screens and our comfort and our endless frictionless entertainment and our increasing chemical management of every uncomfortable internal feeling is to engineer away even the thrashing, to skip the rage entirely, to go straight to the beautiful ones, to produce not a population that rages against the dying of its social world, but one that withdraws from it placidly contentedly, comfortably, with a glowing device in its hand and a feeling of being perfectly connected, grooming itself in a clean, warm, quiet room, asking nothing, offering nothing, ending childless, and never once, not for a single moment, feeling that anything at all was wrong. The mice, at least, screamed. They thought there was something still alive in them to break. That might be the part we improved on. We may have found a way to have the first death without the noise. A quiet extinction, fully content, well lit, comfortable to the end. I told you, a long time ago now, that I would come back to Marsden's mice, the rescued ones, the survivors he pulled out of the dying universe and gave a second chance. A fresh, low-density world with space and safety and everything they would need to rebuild a society from the ground up. This is the fact I have been holding back this entire time, the one that decides what kind of story all of this actually is, and I have held it this long on purpose, because you needed every single thing that came before it in order to feel the full weight of what I am about to tell you. They did not recover. Marsden took animals out of the collapse and placed them in conditions that should have permitted a complete recovery. He gave them room, safety, time, fresh resources, and the opportunity to build the structured, breeding, functioning kind of society that their own grandparents had assembled so effortlessly in Phase A in that very same kind of world only a few hundred days earlier. And they could not do it. They showed what was described as a nearly total loss of the capacity to develop a structured society or to engage in the full repertoire of reproductive behaviour, even paired with normal, healthy mates, even given the space and the safety and the time and every material thing a mouse could possibly require. The damage did not reverse when the environment improved, because the damage had never been in the environment. The window had closed during their infancy inside the broken world, the critical developmental period in which a mammal learns how to be a member of its kind, and once that window had closed, the perfect world that came afterward could not pry it back open. You could give them paradise twice over. The second paradise was utterly powerless to undo what the first one had done to them in the first weeks of their lives. That is the fact. That is the one that should genuinely frighten you, far more than the extinction itself. Because an extinction, in the abstract, is just an ending, and endings can be sad without being terrifying. This is worse than an ending. This is the discovery that the capacity for the behaviours that constitute a social life, once it fails to develop in a generation raised inside the collapse, does not come back. It cannot be restored by fixing the conditions afterward. It cannot be brought back with abundance, because abundance is what broke it. The first death is not a phase you pass through and then recover from once things improve. The first death is permanent. The spirit, once it has failed to form in the young, does not form late. There is no second window. I want to be precise about why this is the single most frightening sentence in the whole account, more frightening than 2,200 dead mice, because it would be easy to feel the horror and misplace it. The horror is not that paradise can kill a population. Lots of things can kill a population. The horror is the order of operations. In every disaster a civilization knows how to fear, the damage comes first, and the warning signs come with it. The famine is visible, while there is still time to ship grain. The plague announces itself in the wards while there is still time to act. The flood, the war, the crash, all of them are legible as they happen, and a society that sees them can, sometimes, respond in time. What Marsden's mice proved is that this particular catastrophe runs in the opposite order. The decisive, irreversible damage, the failure of a generation to develop the capacity for a continued social life, happens in silence, during the years when everything still looks like success, and it is finished and locked before it produces a single symptom you would recognise as alarming. By the time the visible signs arrive, the falling birth rate, the rising withdrawal, the emptying schools, the thing that caused them is already a closed chapter, already a generation deep, already past the only window in which it could have been addressed. You do not get to see this one coming and then act. The seeing and the acting are separated by a wall of years, and the wall only becomes visible from the wrong side of it. That is what Marsden found in a handful of rescued mice who could not be rescued. The rescue was always going to arrive after the only moment a rescue was possible. That is the design flaw, if it is one, in this specific way of dying. The alarm is wired to ring only after the fire is out and the house is already ash. And this is the implication that Calhoun was circling for his entire life, underneath the equation and the verses from Revelation and the unfinished novel about a bred to survive post-human species. The implication that I have come to believe actually destroyed his peace, and it is this. If a society allows the conditions to persist long enough to raise even one full generation inside the broken social world, a generation that never learns, in the critical and unrepeatable window of its youth, how to bond and build and continue, then the catastrophe becomes irreversible at the exact moment it becomes invisible. You will not see it arrive in a crime wave. You will not see it in a famine or a plague or a war, in any of the loud, legible, historical ways that civilizations have always feared. You will see it, if you manage to see it at all, in a birth rate that quietly slips below replacement, in a survey that finds 1.5 million people who have withdrawn from the world, in a 70% decline in the hours the young spend in the same room as one another, in a generation that is comfortable and connected and content, and well provided for, and simply not having children, not bonding, not building, not, in the way the species absolutely requires, fully switching on. And by the time those numbers become undeniable, by the time the second death is plainly visible in the demographics for anyone to read, the first death will already be a generation old, already finished, already past the window, already permanent. The patient will look healthy, loud, packed, productive, alive online, more connected than anyone in history, and it will already be over, and the date of the last one will already, in principle, be calculable, written down in advance, the way Calhoun wrote it, before the relevant child is even born. This is the point in the story where, in any normal version of it, I would now turn and reassure you. I would tell you that humans are not mice, that we have culture and language and institutions and history and the demonstrated capacity to change course, that we have conceptual space, Calhoun's own word, his own genuine hope, the very thing he believed might be our exit, our singular ability to keep inventing new dimensions of meaning to grow into when the old frontiers seal shut against us. And all of that is true. Calhoun believed it, fiercely, to the end. It was the cure that nobody wanted to hear. The Dawn's he died trying to deliver while the world clutched the doomsday and turned its face away from him. The exit may be real. He thought it was real. But I keep coming back to his last note, the one he wrote when his own funding was cut, when his own life's work hit its own wall of scarcity, when the institution he had served for 33 years decided that it was drugs, period, and stopped listening to him. 3 words. It is finished. The optimist wrote those 3 words. At the end, the man who had spent his life arguing for the way out. And I do not know how to weigh his hope against his despair, because the same man held both, and because he was watching, in his own career, in real time, with his own eyes. The society declined to engage with the one warning that might have helped it, watching it withdraw from the difficult, complicated, demanding cure and reach instead for the easy chemical comfort, the pill, the period at the end of the sentence. He did not merely predict the first death from the outside. He lived inside it. He watched his own most important idea die that death, watched it reduced to a walking husk, a horror story, a meme, while he was still alive to see it walk around without him in it. In the introduction he wrote to that paper, the one preserved in his own hand, after all the mice and all the phases and all the grim equations, he allowed himself a single direct sentence about us, about people, about you. People aren't mice, he wrote. We can adapt. And then, underneath it, the last thing. 2 words. A question he left open, because he was too honest to close it, and because more than 50 years later nobody has been able to close it either, and because every piece of data that has come in since he wrote it has made the answer not more comforting but less. Can we? The food hoppers are still full, the water never ran out, the homes are mostly empty. Nothing is hunting us, nothing is starving us. We have removed, with enormous success and the very best of intentions, very nearly every external reason a population has ever had to die. And the birth rate is 0.75, and falling, and the window does not reopen, and the date of the last one is, in principle, already a number waiting to be written. You were never going to feel it coming. That is the whole point. That is what the first death is. You feel fine,